Welcome to Inside Criminal Minds, the channel that will guide you through the darkest corners of the human mind. Today, we're talking about Ed Kemper. Please note that this episode contains depictions of violence that some people may find disturbing, but we won't go into too much detail. Today's story begins on the 18th of December 1948 in Burbank, California, where a young couple, Edmund and Clarnell, welcomed their second child and only son, Edmund Kemper III. From now on, we'll call him Ed, to avoid confusion with his father. One important detail about this couple is that they were not happy at all. Edmund worked as an electrician, but he was a World War II veteran, and he once stated that, quote-unquote, suicide missions in wartime and the atomic bomb testings were nothing compared to living with Clarnell, and that she affected him more than 396 days and nights of fighting on the front did. I'd say this explains how he felt about their marriage, and it definitely gives the idea of an unhappy household. Ed himself explained that, very early, my natural parents were always loud and arguing, which terrified me emotionally of anything very loud and very pushy. As I was growing up, I shied away from loud noises and arguments. But now, let's go back to Little Ed, or Big Ed as he was nicknamed. If you haven't seen any photos of him, you need to know he was a very big boy. When he was born, he weighed 13 pounds, which is almost 6 kilograms, and he'd grow up to be 6 feet and 9 inches tall, more than 2 meters. Anyways, when Ed was 9 years old, his parents divorced, which was devastating for him because he had a close relationship with his father, but a terrible one with his mother, and it was decided that he'd be raised by her. So they moved to Montana. At this point, Clarnell developed a drinking problem and became very abusive, especially towards her son, whom she mocked for his size, humiliated and belittled in many ways. She thought he was, quote-unquote, a real weirdo, and she told him that no woman would ever love him because he was just like his father. And she never hugged or kissed him because she believed that any signs of affection from her would turn him gay. Again, quote-unquote. This is particularly shocking to me. It made me furious to read this quote. Now, it was speculated that she might have had borderline personality disorder, which, if not treated, includes inappropriate anger, difficulty managing feelings and behavior with consequential unstable relationships. I believe it would explain many things. Clarnell also made Ed sleep in a basement that she would lock because she feared that he would harm his sisters. And this might make you wonder, did something in his behavior trigger this kind of response? Well, Ed had what he called dark fantasies. Traditional games would become boring very quickly for him, and he enjoyed less conventional games, such as gas chamber and electric chair. He'd have his younger sister tie him up and flip a fake or imaginary switch so he could pretend that he was dying by execution. I'll give you a moment to process that. He also enjoyed removing the hands and heads of his sister's dolls and sneaking out of the house in order to go to his teacher's house and spy on her through the window. Another hobby of his was following women in the streets and fantasizing that they would love him. Now, I know that this behavior is worrying enough, but I find it even more upsetting that he was very cruel to animals. He tortured insects, and when he was 10, Please skip these 30 seconds if you're particularly sensitive to cruelty on animals. And so he buried the family cat alive, and when he was sure it had died, he dug it up, beheaded it, put its head on a spike, and left it there for everyone to see. Of course, when the cat disappeared, the family asked him if he knew something, and obviously he didn't tell the truth, he lied. And he said, lying was a very pleasant experience. Unfortunately, a few years later, he did it again. He killed another cat simply because the poor creature loved his younger sister more than it loved him. And he decapitated this cat as well, but this time he kept its remains in his wardrobe until his mother found them. Now, I would like to take a break here because I understand this is a lot to digest. Freud theorized for the first time in 1905 that we should pay a lot of attention to children who are especially cruel to animals. And I know Freud was, like lots of his theories were debunked, and he's not everyone's favorite, right? However, over time, researchers and experts have provided us with plenty of evidence that a manifestation of violence towards animals during childhood is very often an early indicator of anger issues, deviant sexual behavior, and a precursor to cruelty to other humans. Let's also consider the fact that Ed Kemper was abused and rejected by a woman that was supposed to be emotionally close to him. She was supposed to love him. And as a child, he was understandably unable to express all the anger and the resentment he felt towards his mother. Even his father, whom he loved dearly, later rejected him as we're about to dive deeper into that. He was unable to make any friends because he lived on an isolated farm and because of his antisocial behavior. So going back to the story, Kemper's mom found the cat's remains in the wardrobe. At this point, their already turbulent relationship got even worse, and Ed, now aged 14, left his mother's house and went to California, hoping that his father would take him in. Once he got there, however, he had to face a harsh reality. His father had a new family, a wife, and a stepson, so it was a disastrous experiment. Senior Kemper's second wife started lamenting migraines when Ed was around, and apparently he made everyone very uneasy. Now, while I feel sorry for young Ed as a child and teenager, we can't blame the stepmother for feeling so uncomfortable around him. He definitely needed therapy and loads of it, but those were different years, I guess. Anyways, his father said, and I'm quoting him, "His personality had changed so much that I was worried about him being here with my present wife, who tried very hard to be a real friend to him. I saw him one day in a brooding mood, and his eyes looked like a sleepwalker. In several talks I had with him toward the last period, he seemed fascinated by death and war. He tried to watch weird tales on TV, which I suppressed." So his father made an important and, I don't know, maybe a bit irresponsible decision. He sent him to live with his paternal grandparents, Maud and Edmund Sr. Now, in 2025, this definitely wouldn't be a great choice, I think, because we have access to therapy, we have access to so many resources that do not require you to abandon your child, because I feel like that's what he did. I don't know, I'm gonna ask you for your opinion. Please write it in the comments. Let me know what you think about it. So Maud, Ed's grandmother, wrote short stories for the local newspaper, and she was also a painter, and a very good one in my opinion. You can see one of her works on our Instagram page, Inside Criminal Minds, and I'm also going to try and insert it in the video. Ed described her as very domineering and strong, constantly, quote-unquote, emasculating her husband and grandson. Ed's grandpa, on the other hand, was loved and admired by Ed, but he was also described as senile and vulnerable now that he was in his 70s. During this year with his grandparents, Ed felt and was even more isolated. He said he was not allowed to bring any friends home or get into any social activities in school. His grandma chose which shows he could watch on TV, and cartoons especially were banned. He said she had placed herself in the position of being, in essence, my warden. And she said, if you ever want to go live with your father again, you'd better do what I say. So, at this point, we can imagine the suffocating tension in this household, and the building rage in Ed Kemper turned him into a walking time bomb. He still had very unhealthy hobbies. He spent hours shooting at animals using a rifle that he'd been gifted by his grandpa, and this served as, I think, some sort of outlet for the growing anger and rage. Maud hated the fact that her grandson killed animals for no apparent reason and took away the rifle, which honestly is completely understandable. But this was, unfortunately, a breaking point, and Ed Kemper had built way too much resentment towards his grandma, and later his mother, Clarnell, would say that the grandparents admitted to being frightened of him and of his moods and deadly glares. This is precisely what they said, deadly glares. On August 27th, 1964, Kemper's grandfather was running errands, so Ed and his grandma were alone at home. Both of them were sitting at a table. Maud was working on one of her short stories, writing on her typewriter, while her grandson was just staring at her with one of those deadly glares. She shivered in fear and she confronted him about it. That started an argument that enraged Ed. He retrieved the confiscated rifle that his grandfather had given him, and he decided to go rabbit hunting to calm his nerves. As he stepped outside on the porch to fetch his dog, Anka, his grandmother said, "You'd better not be shooting the birds again." Ed stopped, turned around, and looked at her through the screen window. She was still typing, facing away from him. He raised his rifle and fired a shot through the screen, straight to her head. Maud fell forward on the table and he shot her again, twice. He then wrapped her head in a towel and dragged her body to the bedroom. He got a knife and stabbed her 3 times with such fury that he broke the knife. He said he didn't think she was dead and he didn't want her to suffer any longer. But I think he simply did it to release the anger he felt. Now, remember, this is a 15-year-old boy. You might think he panicked, and you might hope he regretted his actions. But no, when his grandfather returned home, Ed greeted him gleefully, and Edmund Sr. greeted him back back with a smile. This poor man, completely unaware of what had just happened to his wife. As he began unloading supplies from the truck, Ed sneaked up closer to his grandfather, and when he turned, Ed placed the rifle about 30 inches from the back of his head and shot him. Now you might wonder why he killed him, since we stated before that he loved his grandpa, right? Well, he later explained that he didn't want his grandfather to see what he'd done to his wife of 50 years, and that he would be angry with Kemper for what he'd done. This is very important. It seems that young Kemper felt a lot of anger towards women, but not towards men who had been kinder to him in general, and he sought their approval. Kemper dragged his grandfather's body to the garage and washed the blood from his hands with a garden hose. He also tried to clean the scene a bit, but eventually called his mom because he didn't know what to do. All this time, he remained very calm, and he sat on the porch as he waited for the police to arrive. When they arrived, he explained that, quote unquote, he just wanted to see what it felt like to shoot Grandma. Wow, that statement gave me chills, personally, but we have more to say. In 1973, Susan Swenson, Ed's eldest sister, recalled his mood in 1964 after their father left him with his parents at the ranch in the mountains in California. And she said, after that school year, while he was 15, he came home to Montana for summer vacations. I spent time with him. I was living back in Helena then. I was still married. In fact, I was 3 weeks away from having my third child, so we spent a lot of time together. He seemed, oh well, I don't know, he could have fun, he could laugh, he could play and be silly and visit and stuff like that, but deep down he seemed awfully hurt. You know, it really sunk in that his dad didn't want him, and this still intensified his love for his father. He just kept reaching and grabbing for him. So we took him fishing and all kinds of things, and then he went back down to Madeira, and it was just a matter of a couple of weeks later that he killed his grandparents. Now, I wonder, would he still have developed all these mental issues if he'd had a loving family, if he hadn't been abused and belittled for so long during his formative years? Maybe yes, but maybe not. Maybe he would have had violent tendencies, but they wouldn't have developed so extremely. He said in 1973, quote unquote, I don't believe I was born to be this way. But honestly, this is just his opinion, right? What do you guys think about it? Please leave a comment if you want to share your opinion. So he was arrested, obviously, and since he was a minor, he wasn't sent to prison, but to Atascadero State Hospital, where he'd spend the next 5 years. There, he was diagnosed as schizophrenic paranoid, and I've got in front of me a transcript of a summary written at the hospital by Mercedes Tilestone, a social worker. I'm going to read a few extracts. For several years prior to the killing, there were numerous indications that this youth was extremely disturbed, had self-destructive impulses, and acted out homicidal impulses against 2 cats over a period of a year. He is overwhelmed with feelings of worthlessness, guilt, parental rejection, and he has great fears that he will suffer a psychotic episode. He has thought long and hard about suicide and has attempted it repeatedly over a number of years. In spite of the tranquilizers, though, Kemper continues to be extremely agitated, anxious, distraught, and preoccupied. He has a tremendous need to talk about himself, has done this with the psychologist and his social worker, and to some extent with the psychiatrist. Kemper is fearful that peers might learn of his commitment offense. In this respect, he is in very good touch with reality. He is sensitive and very much aware of the unacceptable nature of the killings. Studying the record and all of Kemper's verbalizations reveals that there were suggestions he would act out violently. It is a tragedy that attention was not paid to these suggestions, and that he was not placed in treatment and help to avert this terrible tragedy of killing both the paternal grandparents. Staff agrees that this youth could be best treated in a mental hospital at this time, and perhaps with some preparation and at a later date be prepared for placement in a treatment program in a youth authority institution. So, they also discovered that Ed was highly intelligent with an IQ of 145. He was very proud of the job he'd held there as head of the psychological testing lab at the age of 19. And he was proud to have worked directly under the hospital's chief psychologist. He said he felt at home at the hospital and he had so many fond memories. The doctors and staff members truly believed they'd had such a positive impact on Edmund that he was, quote-unquote, healed and no longer a threat to society. But in reality, Ed later explained that he'd been having very dark fantasies. He said his final fantasy was, I killed someone, cut them up, and ate them. And I kept the head on a shelf and talked to it. I said the same things I would have said had she been alive, in love with me, and had she been caring of me. Now, you should know while editing the episode I had to cut a very long silence here because, again, the things he said, chilling, truly chilling. So when he was asked if he ever told anyone at the hospital about these fantasies, Ed replied, no, I would have never got out if I had told psychiatrists I was having these fantasies. I would have never gotten out, ever. And this made me think, was he actually so sensitive and aware of the seriousness of his offenses if he said such a thing? If he thought, I'm not going to say anything or else they won't let me out, how is it possible? Like, if he was so smart, how could he not understand he was a threat to society and therefore he should have told everyone at the hospital to prevent him from harming someone else? It sounds to me like he manipulated everyone so that they believed he was okay, he could be released. But unfortunately, that's not what happened, and very soon he was released from the hospital. This is the end of part 1 of this episode. Please consider leaving a comment. I would love to hear your opinion on this case. You can also subscribe or follow our Instagram page Inside Criminal Minds. Also, please check out part 2 of the episode. Thank you again for listening. Stay safe and take care.